But there were periods of time where the Cold War did turn to conflict, just not directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so one of the early tests in this Cold War conflict was the Korean War. So Korea, after World War II, had been divided much like Germany. The northern half was communist, the southern was a pro-Western regime that was supported by the United States. And the North, in pretty surprise move, they're going to launch this attack against the South and capture almost all of Korea very quickly. And the United States, supported by the United Nations, is going to send troops to drive the North Koreans back to the original border. However, once they drive them back to the original border at the 38th parallel, Douglas MacArthur and the United States decided they wanted more. And so they push the North Korean troops all the way back to the border with China. Well, at that point, China steps in and they kind of drive everybody back down to that original border at the 38th parallel again. And there, for the next couple of years, a stalemate develops. And the border stayed at about the same place over the next couple of years, but troops continued to die. And it would take a couple of years before eventually they agreed to a ceasefire. And the end result was basically Korea stayed the same. The border stayed at about the same place at the 38th parallel. North Korea remained communist as they still are today. South Korea remained capitalist as they still are today. So the idea of containment was established by the Truman Doctrine, but that was the biggest reason why the United States became involved in conflicts like Korea. They were trying to stop the spread of communism. And what they were really afraid of was the idea of this domino theory. And this was especially true in Southeast Asia when they become involved in Vietnam. But they were afraid if they allowed one country to fall to communism, that soon others would fall, like a row of dominoes, one after another, until eventually the whole region became communist. And so that's going to pull them into many conflicts around the globe in this quest to stop the spread of communism. The closest we came to direct war with the Soviets would actually take place in Cuba. So in Cuba, they were under the control of a very unpopular dictator named Batista. And Fidel Castro is going to lead a coup d'etat and overthrows this unpopular dictator and gains control of Cuba. Well, he then shocks the United States when he announces that he's going to build a socialist government right there in Cuba. So now we had this communist regime 90 miles off our coast. And so the United States didn't like that very much, and they decide to cut off trade with Cuba. Well, that was big for Cuba because the US was purchasing like half of their sugar exports. And ultimately, all that did was really push Fidel Castro closer to the Soviet Union, because the Soviets step in and they agreed to purchase all these goods from Cuba instead. And so it kind of helped build that relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. And so the United States comes up with this plan known as the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Fidel Castro. And their plan was to train these Cuban rebels, 1,200 Cuban rebels, and then land them in the Bay of Pigs, which is a bay there in Cuba. And they were supposed to lead this revolution and gain support and overthrow Fidel Castro. And so the CIA helped train these Cuban rebels, but the United States was also supposed to provide air support. Well, when Kennedy becomes president, he kind of inherits this Bay of Pigs plan and didn't like it and refused to add in the air support. And so they drop these rebels off without any support. They're unable to win over people to their cause and very quickly are surrounded by Fidel Castro's troops and ultimately imprisoned. And sometime later, the United States would eventually negotiate the release. But the Bay of Pigs was a complete disaster. First off, it looked terrible that the United States had tried to overthrow this foreign leader. And secondly, they had failed in doing so. And so that's going to lead us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest we came to direct war with the Soviet Union throughout the entire decades of the Cold War. So while flying over Cuba one day in October, the United States discovers nuclear missiles in Cuba. And Very quickly, Kennedy decides the best route would be to set up a blockade around Cuba and prevent any ships from coming or leaving. And so he sets up this blockade. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union had ships on the way, they had submarines on the way. And basically, for 2 weeks, we were on the brink of war with the Soviet Union. Had either side fired up on each other in the midst of that blockade, it very easily could have led to war. However, luckily, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, decides to back down. And the final agreement under the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the Soviet Union would remove their missiles that they had in Cuba. And in return, the United States promised not to overthrow Fidel Castro. And secretly, Kennedy also had to promise to remove some missiles that the United States had in Turkey.